So I'm going to talk about interactions between the biosphere, land biosphere, and feedbacks to habitability. And I don't mean habitability in a yes or no sense for the planet, but actually the extent of habitability over the surface of the planet, where being spatially explicit actually matters. Why do we care? One is biosignature, signal strength. Some of you know about the vegetation red edge, which is this reflectance signature of vegetation on the Earth's surface, and where the plants distribute over the overland surfaces determines how strong that signal can be. The rise of plants also can strongly influence how strong the O2 signal could be. The surface signature, if you're looking for signs of life, can be used to corroborate, for example, cases of ambiguous O2 as a possible false positive. And the heterogeneity of climate distribution affects the productivity of life on land and the surfaces of cover. The land biosphere can affect other astronomical observables that we might be interested in, like planetary albedo. So the focus of the talk will be a bit more toward biophysics and vegetation, because that's my background. This is a site for my PhD project that we set up to measure eddy covariance of CO2, energy, and water vapor over an oak savanna. So I won't be dealing as much with the geochemical feedbacks. Chris and Stephanie do that much better. But how did plants get onto land in the first place? As Stephanie and Chris set up, anoxygenic photosynthesis started out in our Kiang. This picture of purple and green sulfur bacteria and microbial mat. Then finally, cyanobacteria figured out how to use chlorophyll A to split water and evolve O2. And then we had the great oxidation event, which Tim Lyons likes to call the great oxidation transition. The cyanobacteria, through endosymbiosis with animal protists, became the plastids of eukaryotic algae. So we got algae growing in the oceans, and first red algae, and then green algae became their more highlight adapted cousins that finally rose to the surface and became the ancestors of land plants. And so the earliest land plants were non-vascular, like lichens and bryophytes. And then we finally got vascular plants with roots and tall canopies. And life continued to take off and evolve on the land with flowering plants, carnivorous plants, and C4 photosynthesis, which is combination architecture and biochemistry change that allows plants to draw down CO2 at lower atmospheric CO2 concentrations. So all these developments, once plants got onto land, worked for the sake of getting more light with canopies and more water with roots and more CO2, and also various symbioses to get more nutrients. There was no change really in the photosystems of plants until we discovered that there are alternatives to oxygenic photosynthesis with chlorophyll A. This was only discovered since 1996. So our evolution on our planet is still happening with far red chlorophylls in cyanobacteria only, though there's suspects now possibly. People are on the hunt right now. This is a hot topic in photosynthesis, looking for far red organisms that can do oxygen photosynthesis. And of course, now we are in the Anthropocene where there's genetic engineering, so things continually evolve and humans modify land cover. Simultaneously with the evolution of oxygenic photosynthesis, of course, there were heterotrophs. Soil bacteria certainly were forming ecosystems in the soil way before land plants, and then fungi and insects and mammals to eat up the plants. So how did all this colonization of the land alter climate? So I'll concentrate just on the exchange of energy, water, carbon, and momentum as influenced by land ecosystems. The processes operate at different timescales. They can be biophysical, biogeochemical, and biogeographical, operating from the diurnal timescale up through geologic. Very critical to that is our seasonality and interannual to decadal timescales, which are harder to pin down in terms of predicting dynamics. Also, these processes operate at different spatial scales, local meteorological to regional, and teleconnections. So the major impact of the ecosystems, of course, is on the albedo of the land surface. So we get reflected shortwave radiation, which affects the temperature. On the right is a plot of the reflectance spectra of various leaves of different kinds of plants. And you can see they all have the similar feature, which is this strong absorbance in the visible with a little green bump that we can see with our eye, and they're very high reflectance in the near infrared, and this is due to the change of index of refraction between leaf mesocell cell walls and air spaces in the leaf. And that contrast that occurs over the red wavelengths is known as the vegetation red edge, which is what satellites pick up to map vegetation, and which has sparked interest among astronomers in vegetation biosignatures. And this is very distinct from the soil surface, so it's unique to plants, and it's a biosignature. When those leaf and soil spectra scale up to the canopy scale, then you get whole ecosystem features for albedo. Most distinctly different are grass versus forest albedos, and then the effect of tree canopies on snow masking, which can affect the timing of snowmelt. Just to give you a satellite view, what happens globally, this is a difference how vegetation alters the albedo relative to bare soil. The middle is a derivation of soil albedos from MODIS satellite data, and on the right is a surface difference from the soil in the visible and the top, and the near infrared in the bottom. So you can see plants significantly darken the surface in most areas. This is an annual mean. Seasonally, there's other kinds of variations too. But they darken the soil in the visible and very strongly brighten it in the near infrared, except in the boreal zone, where there's different kinds of soils, as well as the leaf albedos in the near infrared tend to be a little lower in the boreal type of plants. You can see major influence on the surface energy balance. Okay, so you get albedo, and then to cool off the surface needs to release that heat through evapotranspiration, affecting sensible latent heat partitioning. And that evapotranspiration is very much controlled by plants through photosynthesis. There's interception and water uptake, but also photosynthesis actively controls the fluxes of water vapor through coupling with uptake of CO2 through pores in the leaf. These pores open and close to regulate the uptake of CO2 and mitigate the loss of water vapor. When all those leaves scale up to the canopy scale, combined with respiration fluxes, then you have your net flux of CO2 and water vapor to the atmosphere. And then those tall canopies further affect the roughness of the surface, which affects the momentum transfer and hence the coupling with the atmosphere. So that's the biophysics in a nutshell. That's what's happening above ground. Here's a map from also some NASA satellite data using a LiDAR-based satellite to map vegetation heights. So you can see we got really tall trees in the, oops, here's the pointer, oops. Here's the pointer. Okay. We got tall trees in the Amazon, and okay, I won't use the pointer. And other temperate rainforest and much shorter vegetation in arid regions. And by the way, I'll back up and note that Mars roughness lengths, I guess, are between 0.1 to 0.8 centimeters, as are Mars people. With vegetation and topography on Earth, it'll be about 10 times that. So these do affect the momentum, the transport between the surface and the atmosphere. So that was above ground. Below ground, things are also happening to affect the physics of the system. Ecosystems do develop the physical hydrological properties of soil, and this is a map of soil types. And there's an eco-hydrological optimality theory that seems to be borne out that the soil vegetation continuum will equilibrate with climate to minimize water stress in the system given the climate. But you can see if you're familiar with vegetation maps, you can see that these soil maps very much map with the vegetation. So all these physical limitations then map out as limitations of vegetation activity. This is a nice map done by Naimani et al. I'm using indices for limitation by temperature, radiation, and water. And you can see the tropics are very radiation limited because there's a lot of clouds all the time. And the high latitudes, temperature limited, sometimes dry, sometimes due to radiation also. And these limitations expressed then in ecosystems or biomes that are ensembles of different kinds of plants that live together. And these boundaries have been categorized by geographers. On the left is what is known as the Whittaker diagram, which is based on only simply annual temperature and precipitation. It's not perfect, but it's a nice reference and rule of thumb. And on the right is the International Biosphere Program classification of biomes by various use of climate and expert knowledge of the systems. And you can see how they distribute with climate. Of course, not only climate controls vegetation distributions, but use of the biogeochemistry also does, and this is the plant strategies for dealing with climate. And you can have more than one strategy successful in the same climate. So you have organisms in the same place with different niches. So the plants take up the carbon and they have to decide where to put that carbon in their growth and when. Also, once they have that carbon, some of it goes into the soil as litter, root exudates, and comes back out as CO2 through soil respiration. And all this turnover and physical and also input of organic matter develops the soil physical properties. This to give you a global picture as an estimate. I'll call it an estimate of the global land carbon budget. This is a nice illustration at how the surface vegetation might not be a good indicator of what's happening below ground because of how pools of carbon can build up. But in general, the soil estimates are really uncertain right now for carbon, but around 1,500 petagrams of carbon, but with estimates as low as 500 to 3,000 petagrams globally. So biogeographical or ecological processes also control the distribution of different vegetation cover types. So here's something you could get from your elementary school class, but basic process of succession and community dynamics, where you have the pioneer stages of say weeds colonizing bare rock where there's poor nutrients, and they gradually bring in say fixed nitrogen and develop the soil, and then woody plants can start to live there, and then the shade tolerant plants gradually grow up taller and outshade the earlier successional plants. And that's kind of textbook stages of succession. Then those mature canopies can get taken out by disturbances like fire. So here's just observations of active fires last year all around the globe. So this is happening all the time. And these lead to renewal of the landscape and patchiness and heterogeneity that can create dynamic equilibria from some systems or perturb them away from what they would like to be, depending on how the disturbance happened. Other disturbances alter the landscape. There's herbivory, insect outbreaks. Below is like spruce budworm outbreak in Oregon, so you can see large areas decimated. Also wind throw, and then invasive species that transport that due to transport of seeds from other places. Humans are the major driver of cover change nowadays. We're in the Anthropocene, so there's conversion of agricultural land to from natural systems, biomass burning, urbanization, and also deforestation. All of these then sum up from biophysical, the seasonal biogeochemistry, and the disturbance dynamics into what we see in atmospheric signals, say CO2. This is observations by the OCO2 satellite assimilated by the Global Modeling and Assimilation Office at Goddard. There's a nice animation of this if you guys haven't seen this gorgeous animation of fluxes of CO2 over the surface. On the right is a kind of early summary of the seasonality of CO2, atmospheric CO2, and the trend due to fossil fuel emissions of rising CO2, and also the hemispheric northern versus southern hemisphere differences due to larger land masses in the northern hemisphere, creating more extreme seasonal CO2 and higher concentrations. So that's how the climate can constrain what ecosystems do and how some of their internal dynamics. But of course, there's local, how we want to know for exoplanets, how do vegetation or ecosystems change the climate? So here's a nice example called Australia Bunny Fence. This is in southwestern Australia, and you can see right away, well, there's clouds over the natural vegetation and none over the cropland. So, of course, it's darker in the visible albedo in the native scrubland, and in general, it's darker, even with the near-infrared reflectance. So this that side is warmer, gets warmer, and it's also deeper rooted, less subject to seasonal variation because of the deeper roots, whereas on the right, the crops are shallow rooted, and they're also subject to seasonal harvesting. So the roughness length of vegetation varies a lot, going down to bare soil. So this results in the scrub native site having higher sensible latent heat fluxes, raising the planetary boundary layer. It can get more likely above the lifting concentration level, so you get cloud formation. This is not happening independently of circulation patterns. There's also a low pressure trough synoptic feature in this region that swings on and off the coast there. And Near et al. Surmised that, and other workers also surmised that there's declining precipitation in this region because that disturbance to the land cover is actually altering the location of that trough. So it's altering moisture convergence from the ocean over the region. So this is an example of a vegetation feedback to altering moisture convergence and local climate and precipitation. Vegetation also alter moisture continental recycling. This is a little harder to pin down. With models, you can simulate it. Above is a GCM modeled simulation where they backed out what's the fraction of the precip that's actually from recycling. The models don't really capture what's happening in the tropics so well. They're notoriously dry in the tropics. Below is a study trying to back it out from oxygen or water isotopes. In which they surmise, based on that transpiration is less enriched than just plain evaporation, you could surmise how much recycling is happening. So there's a lot happening in the tropics and mostly interior continental areas. The backing this up for the tropics is a concern because deforestation in the tropics could be driving loss of precipitation. This is a good example contrasting local versus larger scale meteorology. So local observations in the tropics actually find, well, it looks like there's precipitation increasing over deforested areas. And why is that? But there's actually decline in precipitation over the forests. So mesoscale models seem to have explained, well, there's actually more convection at the grass forest boundaries, increasing, so that allows vapor transfer for the forest to the grassland, and so you get precipitation of the grassland. However, this phenomenon is sensitive to the size and heterogeneity of the clearings. So you get small clearings, you could get an increase in precipitation, but if there's a tipping point. If you get larger, then you start to lose precipitation. Now, macro scale or GCM scale models can't capture this kind of dynamic because they're too large scale. They're not the sufficient spatial resolution for simulating cloud formation, really, and that's always parameterized, as you know. They also have all the models right now, and this is fixable, and we're trying to fix this in the GCM. They have insufficient soil depth in the tropics. So these could be causing insufficient continental recycling and insufficient moisture convergence, and in general, just that's why we have low precip over the tropics. I should also note that David Medvigi did a variable resolution GCM that shows a little less extreme decline. Most of the GCM studies do experiments that are drastically deforest all of the tropics and see what happens with it. But David Medvigi, so if you have variable resolution, you can capture some of the small scale effects and then have less decline. And if you have an interactive ocean, you get actually a stronger effect. Yep. Oh, okay, shoot, Okay, macro scale models are also good for showing teleconnections. I'll just say really quickly, this is a nice summary by Lawrence and Vadekar of previous studies, GCM studies, looking at teleconnections. But so they show you do something, one place it happens, something else happens here, you get a decline or increase in precipitation. But these are hard to back up because at the same time as deforestation happening, we're also getting global warming happening and ocean circulation changing. Here's a nice study that shows more cleanly what happens if you replace mid-latitudes grasslands with forests. This was done by Abigail Swan. And what she found is you get warming in the upper higher latitudes because the forests absorb more radiation, and this because the system has to export the heat back southward. This shifts the heavy circulation, and you get more precipitation northward and drying in the southern boundary of the Amazon. And this actually seems to explain some phenomena in some paleoclimate scenario, which will go next. Okay, so that's vegetation changes between vegetation. What we want to know for given planets, of course, is, well, if you have an abiotic planet and then put plants on, then how's that going to change the climate? So plants started out as bryophytes and lichens back in the early Ordovician. And those are the continents then. Nobody's really done this experiment to know what the plants did, but here's below is a study of what happens with if you include lichens and bryophytes in your model of interception of rainfall, and they estimate, well, some regions could intercept as much as 60% more. And Dave Chris just went to Iceland and showed me a wonderful landscape photo of lichens covering the landscape. So some of these might be well shaded out by other canopies, but in a place like Iceland or on the early Earth, lichens could have made a significant impact on the evapotranspiration in the climate and altered climate. And hence weathering by organic acids and roots led to a strong drawdown of CO2 after plants arrived on land. I'm running out of time. In the last 120,000 years, there's a simulation of where plants might have distributed. If you prescribe the climate, this is not an interactive modeling, but you can see they shifted around a bit. This is just the last 120 years with modern climates. And there's also phenomena of the last 6,000 years in the mid-Holocene with the green Sahara that has been noted by fossil evidence, and the climate models have trouble simulating this. There's the paleoclimate model intercomparison study shows that if you account for the spread of deciduous trees in the mid-latitudes across Europe, which happen at the same time, you can get a little bit more precipitation happening. But in general, the models can't simulate the increase in precipitation that's needed to account for these fossil evidence of plants. So there's more to do. There's heterogeneity in the system, and if you had a green Sahara, you could see probably more vegetation red edge for an exoplanet kind of study. There's also negative feedbacks. How much time do I have? Oh shit. Okay. All right. Okay. So negative feedbacks. This is the last 30 years from CO2 fertilization. Actually, we have to thank the plants for getting fertilized and then keeping us a little cooler than we otherwise might be. But that effect is going to go away pretty soon. Their capacity to do that is going to go away. And the land models actually are doing a really bad job right now predicting what's going to happen in the future. But in general, there's these various both negative and positive feedbacks from plants to climate. And And this is just a mapping by another geographer system for saying, well, if you project the climate, here's where the ecosystem might shift. But actually, ecosystems don't shift wholesale in biomes. The plants will migrate individualistically, opportunistically, and form new assemblages. But this is likely could be happening. And if I stop the simulation just for the last couple of decades, it's happening. It's kind of scary. Okay. So there are other things that can happen. Ecological dynamics interacting with climate changes. This is you could have alternative stable states for a given climate just because of little variations and, say, a disturbance. And this example is on the top in the black line is a stable forest state, but if it starts to experience drought, it'll become vulnerable, say, a deforestation or fire that could switch it to a savanna state where there's more grasses. And then a dynamic equilibrium could maintain that savanna state with fire going on. But then a drought could also kick that system down to pure grassland state if it experiences, vulnerability to drought. And there's other examples where you could go to desertification. So you could go to your vegetation red edge and then bare soil and not see the signal. So these things are interactive. So something to account for if you're going to simulate life on another planet. This is I call it a polemic by Stefan et al. About what we should do to make sure we don't go off into the hothouse Earth, which happened in the past, and how we can do all this intense engineering of CO2 mitigation to keep the Earth in a nice stabilized state, kind of close to where we're comfortable. And I should note that these are all time slice equilibria along a biogeochemical evolutionary path. But those time slice equilibria create what we are going to see. We're going to see snapshots in time when we observe planets with upcoming missions, and how could they possibly vary along that biogeochemical path. This is just a fun little look with what happens if you have Proxima Centauri b and it's tidally locked. This is actually aquaplanet climate because we didn't do land yet. But I classified the climate with this geographer biome class system, and we get warm. We get the substellar point. We get warm, temperate, fully humid with warm summer, and then it quickly moves over to arid desert and then polar frost. So if you want to see this signal, you'd have to look probably when the planet's not facing the star on the, but passing on the side at a crescent phase, and maybe you could see things at the substellar point, but you're not going to see any life elsewhere because it'll be frost. So conclusions, there's biophysical tipping points due to plants affecting climate, and they could have changed climate habitability of the planet's surface. And there are dynamic equilibria that feed back with circulation patterns. They're interactive. They don't operate always independently. And so we need to understand these dynamic equilibria along the biogeochemical evolution of the planet. There are a lot of poorly understood processes with vegetation right now. The seasonal strategies will not happen on another planet, for example. They'll be totally differently adapted. But in general, independent of orbital forcings, land biosphere activity, that's including us, does alter local, regional, and global climate and could affect what signal we see of an exoplanet.
So we have time for maybe one question. There.
Great talk. So like say in 100 years when we have lots of like exoplanet environments and we have these like stable climate snapshots, would be the way we would go from these snapshots to maybe a more fuller picture be something like climate survival analysis or other statistical methods.
So I put this plot up here. This is from a special collection on exoplanet biosignatures issue. It came out that we put out from a workshop a couple years ago on exoplanet biosignatures. And what emerged from that are Bayesian frameworks to get probabilities out and all the attachments. So I encourage everybody, it's a sales pitch, to go look at ideas in that issue and how to put all the different pieces together in this kind of Bayesian framework to surmise your uncertainty.